Hello there, welcome to HFY Quantum Pro. Here, helping one another makes the universe smarter. So, what we are waiting for? Let's begin our story.
The laughter started before the human delegation even finished walking through the doors. IT was not loud at first. It came from the upper tiers of the grand chamber, a low ripple of sound, the kind that passes between people who share a joke they do not need to explain. By the time the six humans had reached the lowest seating tier, the one reserved for observer species, the ripple had become a wave. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Senate held 412 delegates from 61 recognized species. Every seat was filled. Every eye, of which some delegates had more than two, turned toward the small group of humans making their way to the observer bench. They were small. That was the first thing most species noticed. Short, two-limbed, soft-skinned. They had no natural armor, no visible venom, no bioluminescence, no secondary nervous system. Nothing that the galaxy recognized as a mark of a species worth taking seriously. They sat down. One of them adjusted her collar. Another set a data tablet on the bench beside him. Simple movements. Ordinary ones. The chamber found even this faintly amusing. Counselor Orvin rose from the senior dais. He was silver-skinned and four-armed, old enough to have sat in this chamber for longer than any living human had been alive. He carried himself the way powerful beings carry themselves when they have never once been told no. He cleared his throat, and the chamber went quiet. He began to read. The petition, he explained, was the 11th submission from the human species requesting full Senate membership. Like the previous 10, it would be reviewed on its merits. He paused at the word merits. A few delegates in the upper tiers made sounds that were not quite laughter, but were not quite not laughter either. He read the list of criteria for membership. Then, one by one, he explained why humanity failed each one. Too short-lived, he said. The average human lifespan was not long enough to build the kind of institutional memoria Senate member required. A human diplomat who began negotiations could be dead before they concluded. Technologically limited, he continued. Human faster-than-light capability was less than 40 years old. They were newcomers who had barely learned to cross their own solar system before arriving to ask for a seat at the oldest governing body in the known galaxy. Emotionally volatile, he added. Studies submitted by 3 different species described human decision-making as dangerously impulsive. They had a documented history of choosing conflict when cooperation was available. And finally, he let this one sit in the air for a moment. They had one world. One. Every full Senate member controlled no fewer than 4 settled systems. Humanity had a single planet, a small lunar base, and a handful of off-mining stations. They were not a civilization in the Senate's meaning of the word. They were a local event. The chamber applauded. It was not a polite applause. It was the kind that meant, yes, exactly. Finally, someone said it plainly. The lead human diplomat, a woman named Lena Solon, stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at the floor. She waited until the applause faded on its own, because she knew it would eventually. And then she spoke. She said that humanity had noted the criteria. She said that humanity had survived 17 documented extinction-level events across its history, including 2 that its own technology had caused. She said that every civilization in the chamber had begun somewhere. She said that humans were patient. That a delegate from the upper tier made a comment that his translation node rendered into something close to patient like a stone is patient. The chamber found this very funny. Lena Solon sat back down. She did not look embarrassed. She looked like someone who had expected exactly this and had decided a long time ago that it did not change what she was going to do. In the corridor behind the chamber's east wall, a man sat in a maintenance crate with his back against the metal and his legs stretched out in front of him. He was listening, not to the words. The walls were too thick for that, but to the sound, the shape of it, the way it rose and fell. His name was Raid Solon. He was Lena's older brother. He was not part of the delegation. He was not supposed to be on this station at all, technically. But Lena had asked him to come, and he had come because that was the kind of relationship they had. He was cleaning a blade he was not supposed to have brought inside the Senate building. He cleaned it the way, cleaned everything, slowly, carefully, without wasting motion. He listened to the sound coming through the wall. He did not need to hear the words to know what it meant. He had grown up on a frontier colony where the soil was poisonous and help was 6 months away. He knew exactly what it sounded like when something that considered itself important looked at something small and decided it did not matter. He put the blade away and he waited for his sister to come out. When she did, she was walking straight, head up, the way their father had taught them both to walk when things were bad. You walked straight. You kept your head up. You did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching you fold. She sat down beside him on a maintenance crate and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They denied it again." He nodded. She said, "I found something, though, while I was in here. Something I wasn't supposed to find." He looked at her then. She had her data tablet in her hands, and her eyes were focused on something he couldn't see. "How bad?" he asked. She thought about it. "Bad enough that they're going to want it back," she said. Down the corridor, a young alien aide named Duvis stood near the chamber's outer door, watching the humans and writing notes on a small pad. He had been assigned to observe the human contingent by Counselor Orvin. His job was to report anything unusual. He watched Lena and Raid sitting together on the crate, quiet, not angry, not crying, just sitting, just thinking. That he wrote. They're not reacting the way he expected. He looked at what he had written. He did not know why it made him feel uneasy. 3 weeks later, a Senate clerk filed a procedural record that would be referenced in political science courses for the next 2 centuries. The record was not dramatic. It did not use strong language. It was 4 paragraphs of administrative notation describing a formal seating of 14 empty chairs where 14 senators had sat until the contents of Asmal Black data drive had been reviewed by an independent tribunal. 14 senators removed. 11 pending prosecution. 3 who had taken early retirement on the same day a tribunal announced it was expanding its scope. Juvith read the record the morning it was filed. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for a few minutes in his small office and looked at the wall that he had submitted his witness account 9 days earlier. His supervisor had read it and struck out 2 lines and handed it back to him and said the language was not appropriate for an official document. Juvith had rewritten those 2 lines 3 times. Each time, his supervisor struck them out again. On the 4th attempt, his supervisor read the lines, put the pen down, and said nothing for a long time. Then he handed the document back without striking anything. The 2 lines that stayed in red, they did not need us to believe in them. They never did. That is what we did not understand. Counselor Orvin was still in his seat. Technically, his 4 arms had developed a habit of resting on the desk in front of him rather than gesturing when Hess spoke, which he did less often now. When reporters gathered outside the Senate building and asked him about the human who had walked into the chamber with the Emperor's head, Orvin said the matter was under review by the appropriate bodies. He said this 11 times over 3 weeks. After the 11th time, reporters stopped asking him. This was noted in several news records as historically significant, because Counselor Orvin had not stopped being asked for his opinion on anything in 40 years. Senator Mira introduced the new membership petition in the 31st day after the incident. She had written it herself, alone, in her office, over 2 evenings. It was shorter than the previous 11 submissions from the human delegation. It was 1 page that IT said that humanity had demonstrated over 11 years of rejected petitions and 1 very direct demonstration of its character, that it met every criterion the Senate cared to apply. IT said that the only question remaining was whether a Senate was prepared to be honest about this. The vote was not closed out on the 47th day. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Senate as a full member. There was a ceremony. The human delegation attended. They were given seats in the main tier for the first time, not the observer bench at the bottom, but the property-eared seats with the translation nodes and the desk panels and the lighting that did not flicker. The senior delegate sat down and placed her hands flat on the new desk and looked at the chamber around her and took 1 slow breath. Nobody laughed. The Dominion of Erech, deprived of its emperor and 3 of its primary Senate allies, and facing a tribunal investigation into its biological weapons program, had gone quiet in the way that powerful things go quiet when they have run out of moves. 3 of its subsidiary factions had already begun separate negotiations with the Senate for independent status, which was the political equivalent of rats finding a ladder. The Outer Rim Mapping Project was formally recognized as lawful intelligence work. The human scouts in that region were granted full transit rights through Dominion-adjacent space. Within 6 months, they would reach the cluster with the unusual energy signatures and find what was there. That was a different story. Raid was not at the ceremony. He had not been in custody since the 3rd day after the incident. A tribunal of 7 species had reviewed his case and declined to prosecute. The official reason given was procedural. Questions of jurisdiction, questions of standing, questions about which legal framework applied when the subject of the action was a sitting emperor visiting a neutral station on private business, and the person who acted was a civilian from a species that was not, at the time, recognized Senate member. Everyone in the legal community understood what the actual reason was. Nobody wrote it down plainly. They did not need to point 3 days after the tribunal decision. Raid was on a transport heading toward the Outer Rim. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He left a message for Duvith that was 2 sentences long. It said, "Thank you for sitting with me in the corridor." It said, "She would have liked you." Duvith read the message 4 times. He kept it, that he was not entirely sure why. He told himself it was because it was a piece of historical record. He did not examine this too closely that on the 47th day, at the same hour that the human delegation was taking its new seats in the Senate chamber. Raid Solon was sitting on the step outside a small way station on a frontier world 3 transit jumps from the station, where all of it had happened. The sky above him was the color of copper, going green, that it was not an earth color. No sky out here was an earth color. He had stopped expecting earth colors a long time ago, that he had a cup of something warm. He did not know what it was made from. It tasted like something between coffee and regret, which felt appropriate. He thought about Leonard. He thought about her in the cafeteria telling Duvith about a city built on water, connected by bridges, where you could walk for hours and never run out of new ways to cross from one place to another. Head hot about her walking out of that chamber, with her head up. He thought about the way she had found the truth buried under 7 layers of financial records. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it was her official job, but because she was the kind-off person who looked at a thing until she understood its shape. She had been better at the world than he was. She had always been better at the world than he was, that he hoped, somewhere in whatever came after, that she knew it had gotten out. That the thing she had found had not stayed buried. That her work had done what she had meant for it to do, that he did not feel like a hero. He felt tired, the way that tired goes deep into the bone and does not fully leave. He felt like a man who had made a decision in a dark corridor and was still not certain how much off it had been justice, and how much had been grief, and how much space there was between those 2 things. He watched the copper-green sky, he thought. She would have liked this view. Not the color. Lena had always preferred blue skies, but the fact of it, a sky on a world that had never heard of her, going about its business, completely unaware that 3 jumps from here a chamber of 412 delegates had just given 6 humans seats at the table that had been refusing them for 11 years. Unaware that 1 woman in a cafeteria, talking about bridges, had started a chain of things that ended here. The universe did not know her name, but it had moved, and that, Raid thought, was something that he finished a drink that tasted like coffee. And regret. He set the cup down on the step beside him, thought he sat with the sky for a while longer. Then he stood up, picked up his bag, and went to see what was next. A document does not need to be complete to be dangerous. It only needs to be true. Lena's partial records. 3 pages of financial connection she had managed to send to a backup relay the afternoon before she died. Had been sitting in a low-priority data buffer for 2 days when a junior communications clerk on the station accidentally pulled them up while searching for a misfiled transit report. She read the first page. Then she read it again. Then she forwarded it to the only person she could think of who might know what to do with it.by the following morning. Copies were moving through private networks of at least a dozen minor delegates.by afternoon. 3 of them had printed hard copies and tucked them into the inner pockets of their formal robes. The Senate called an emergency session. Not about Lena. Not about the financial connections. Not about the Dominion. Not about any of the things the document described. The emergency session was called because an unverified document was circulating and creating instability, and instability was something the Senate took more seriously than almost anything else. Councillor Orvin took the floor, that he was calm. He had the kind of calm that comes from practice, from decades of standing in front of body-soft power and choosing which version of the truth to present. He explained that the document in question had been traced back to the human delegation. He said this as though it was an explanation in itself. He let the implications settle over the chamber like dust that he said the document was unverified. He said the timing, appearing immediately after the Human petition's rejection, was not a coincidence. He said this was what desperation looked like when auspices had run out of legitimate options. Several delegates nodded. A few others looked to their hands. Senator Mira stood up. She was not a large presence in the chamber. She represented a mid-tier species, not wealthy, not militarily significant. She was the kind of senator who attended every session and was rarely called on. She had voted against the human petition each time I came up, not because she disliked humans, but because she had not yet seen a reason to go against the majority. She had read the document that morning. She asked for an independent investigation. Orvin did not look at her while she spoke. He waited until she was finished and then asked the Chamberdo vote, 34-1 against. Mira sat back down. She put the printed copy of the document flat on the desk in front of her and kept her hand on IT in the gallery above the chamber floor. Duvith watched all of this and wrote nothing. Raid was not in the gallery. He had not been in the gallery or the cafeteria or any of the places the human delegation used. For the past 18 hours, he had been a part of the station that most people who lived on it would have been surprised to know existed. The station had been built in sections over 2 centuries. The original core had been expanded outward 11 times, and each expansion had been attached to the previous one with practical urgency and minimal planning. This meant there were gaps, corridors that had been sealed off when a new section made them redundant, maintenance tunnels that appeared on original schematics but not on current ones, spaces the station's administrative system listed as structural and had not physically inspected in decades. Raid had found 4 of them on the first day, but he had used the third one today because it ran behind the Dominion's private docking section and had a junction box on its eastern wall that somebody had cut a small square of paneling away from a long time ago for reasons that no longer mattered. Through that gap, if a person pressed close and was patient, they could see into the Dominion section's secondary cargo area. Raid had been patient. What he saw was a set of sealed cargo containers marked with a biological hazard symbol he recognized from his time on the frontier. The symbol meant contained pathogen. The containers were not standard freight. They were military-grade sealed units, the kind used for weapons programs, the kind that required specific authorization codes that were not in any public registry. They had been offloaded from a Dominion vessel that had docked quietly 2 nights ago and listed its cargo as diplomatic supplies. Raid looked at the containers for a long time, but he thought about what Lena had said. Something buried. Something worth killing to keep buried, that he thought about the Outer Rim, about the human scouts who had been quietly mapping the space beyond Dominion territory for the past 7 years. He thought about what those scouts might find if they pushed far enough into that region. He had one of the scouts' preliminary reports on his own tablet. It had been passed to the delegation as background reading. Most of it was navigational data. But one section noted unusual energy signatures coming from a cluster of uninhabited systems inside Dominion-adjacent space. Not natural energy signatures that he pressed back from the gap. He sat in the dark off the maintenance corridor and let his eyes adjust. His sister had been trying to tell the Senate what these containers represented. She had been trying to show them that the Dominion had a weapons program targeted at human-compatible biology and that they had been paying senators to keep humanity away from the space where that program was being run. She had not been able to finish saying it, that he was going to finish it for her. Not with words. Words had not worked. Words had gotten 34 votes and won. He pulled out his tablet and checked the time that he had received a message from Juvith that morning. IT had been sent from a public terminal and signed, but Ray knew who it was from because only one person on this station had reason to send him information without putting their name on it. The message had 3 sentences that IT said, "The Emperor is visiting." It said, "Private session with Senate leadership." It said, 48 hours. Raid sat in the dark with this information. 48 hours. He thought about the containers. He thought about his sister on that walkway in the bad light. Had had about 34 votes, and one that he thought about his father's voice, the one that had been living in the back of his head since he was 7 years old. A small boy watching his father rebuild a water filter that had broken for the fourth time on a world where water that was not filtered would kill you. His father had not cursed. He had not blamed anyone. He had just looked at the broken thing and said, "Well, let's see what we can do." Raid put his tablet away. That he looked at the corridor ahead of him. 48 hours. He thought that he had worked with less. When Raid was 9 years old, a pipe burst in the colony's water reclamation unit, and the repair team was 3 days away. His father spent those 3 days awake. Not panicking, not waiting, working. He used parts from a broken irrigation pump and a piece of hull sheeting and something he cut from an old boot, and he made a seal that should not have worked but did. He was not an engineer. He had never been trained for this. He just looked at the problem until he understood its shape, and then he filled the shape with whatever he had. Raid had watched all of this from the corner of the room, small and quiet, the way children are when they understand something important is happening. When it was done, and the water was running clean again, his father had sat down on the floor right where he was standing and put his face in his hands, not crying, just resting. Then he had looked up and seen Raid watching him and said, "We don't stop, son. That is the one thing we don't do. The universe doesn't care if we're tired." Raid had not fully understood it then. He understood it now, 26 years later, lying flat on his back inside a ceiling access panel 2 levels above the Dominion's private quarters section, listening to a guard rotation complete itself below him. He had been inside the panel for 4 hours. He had not chosen the ceiling because it was dramatic. He had chosen it because a ceiling access panel in an older section of the station had a 30-second window during rotation change where a guard was positioned directly beneath it, and because the crawl space above it connected through 2 junctions and one very narrow horizontal pipe run to the HVAC maintenance corridor that ran along the back wall of the private quarters wing. He had mapped all of this in his head over 3 days of walking the station. Not because he had planned this from the beginning, because mapping was what he did whenever he was somewhere new. That he had done it since the frontier. Knowing the ground under your feet was not a strategy. It was a habit. Sometimes habits saved your life. That he waited for the guard rotation, that he heard the footsteps stop. He heard voices, brief and casual, the way guards talk to each other when they are bored. He gave it 15 seconds after voices faded. Then he moved. The crawl space was not designed for a human body, but it fit one. Just barely. He moved through the way he moved through everything difficult. Not fast, not slow, with complete attention to where his weight was going and how much noise each shift made. He reached the HVAC corridor. He dropped down. He was in. The private quarters wing had 6 rooms. He did not know which one Varric used. He had guessed it would be the one farthest from the main corridor entrance, the room that required the most commitment to reach, which was also the room that felt most secure to someone used to being protected be distanced. That he was right. He knew he was right when he saw the 2 guards posted outside the last door instead of phone. And he did not go through the door. He waited in the service alcove at the end of the corridor, and he watched the 2 guards, and it counted. He did this for 3 hours, not because he enjoyed it, because in 3 hours, a pattern always showed itself. Humans were good at patterns. They were also good at noticing when other beings thought they were unpredictable, but were not at 8 the 2-hour and 40-minute mark. Both guards turned to speak to each other at the same time. They did it because a sound came from the main corridor, a distant announcement from the station's public address system. It was brief. It happened every 6 hours. Both guards had stopped registering it as something that required attention, but they both turned their heads toward it out of old habit. 90 seconds. Both guards turned their heads. Raid was already moving. What happened in that room was not clean or heroic or worthy of the kind of story that gets told edibles. Raid was not larger than Varric's personal guard, the one stationed inside the room, and Hugh was not faster in any way that would have impressed anyone watching. He was simply harder to stop than a guard expected. This was the thing about humans that the galaxy kept failing to account for. Not their strength, their threshold. Most species, when they reach a certain level off pain or resistance, sent a signal to themselves that said, "This is the limit. This is where stopping is reasonable." It was biological wisdom. It prevented waste. Humans had that signal too. They had just learned, over long millennia on a hard and unforgiving world, to negotiate with IT.T, look at the signal and say, not yet. A few more seconds. Just a little further. The personal guard hit his limit first. Raid did not. Emperor Varek, in his final moments, said something in his own language that the translation node on Raid's collar rendered as, "You cannot be here." Raid did not respond. He had not come to argue. Afterward, he wrapped what he needed to carry in a piece of maintenance cloth he had brought for the purpose. He checked himself. He adjusted the maintenance uniform that had gotten him into this section without a second glance, because maintenance workers were the same on every station in the galaxy. Invisible, present, and necessary, and therefore not worth looking at it. He walked back the way he had come. Past the guards who were still talking, past the staff who were checking their tablets, past 3 separate security checkpoints where someone looked at his uniform and his calm face and his ordinary way of moving and decided, without thinking about it very deeply, that he was Summonil's problem to check. That he walked to the service level. He found a quiet alcove. He sat down. He put the wrap cloth on his knee and rested his hand on it. And he thought about a 9-year-old boy in the corner of a room watching his father fix something that could not be fixed. He thought about Lena walking out of the grand chamber with her head up. He thought about 34 votes, and wondered. Then he stood up, tucked the cloth under his arm, and went to finish what his sister had started. The grand chamber of the Galactic Senate was in closed session when the doors opened. Not the main doors. Those were sealed and guarded. The doors that opened were the service access doors on the chamber's east wall, the ones that maintenance staff used to access the lighting rigs above the gallery. They were not supposed to open during session. There was no mechanism that was supposed to allow it. Raid had found the override panel behind a conduit box on his second day of walking the station. He came through the doors in the maintenance uniform, carrying the wrap cloth under one arm, and Hewitt directly toward the center of the chamber floor. 412 delegates were in their seats. Every eye in the room turned to watch him. The species that had multiple eyes used all of them. The speaking circle in the center of the chamber floor was reserved for recognized Senate members. There was a physical marker on the floor, a ring of inlaid metal, polished and old, the kind of old that meant it had been there longer than most of the civilizations in the room. Protocol said that only a recognized member could enter that circle during session. Raid stepped over the ring and into the circle. Nobody spoke. Not yet. The shock of the thing was still doing its work on the room. That he crouched down and set the wrap cloth on the floor off the speaking circle. He unfolded it slowly, without drama, the way a person unwraps something they have carried a long way and are finally setting down. Then he stood back up. The cloth was open. The chamber went silent in a way that went past quiet and into something else. Something that had no word for it in any of the 61 languages represented in the room. It was the silence of a moment that everyone present understood, immediately and without question, was going to divide their lives into before and after on the floor of the speaking circle, on the polished inlaid metal ring that had held this chamber's proceedings for longer than most civilizations had existed, sat the head of Emperor Varek of the Dominion of Erek. Raid did not perform it. He did not look around the room to watch their faces. He just stood there, hands at his sides, in a maintenance uniform, and waited for the room to catch up with what it was seeing. He looked at a point on the far wall. Then he spoke 0.6 words. My sister found what he buried. He stepped back. He put his hands behind his back. That he waited. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the chamber came apart. Counselor Orvin was on his feet before most delegates had finished standing. He was pointing at Raid, and his voice was doing things that required his translation node to work at full capacity. He was calling for arrest. He was calling for the security response team. He was calling for the Sessionto be suspended and then immediately not suspended, because suspending it meant the delegates could leave and he needed them in the room while he controlled the framing of what had just happened. That he was a man who had spent decades controlling rooms. He looked at Raid while he was shouting, and for a moment something crossed his face that was not anger. It was the look of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was not the ground they thought it was. Raid did not look back at him. 12 security officers came through the main door set a run. They spread around the speaking circle. They had weapons out, which they were not supposed to do in the chamber, but the sight of what was on the floor had removed several layers of their procedural training. None of them touched him yet. He was not moving, he was not threatening anyone. He was just standing in the circle with his hands behind his back and the calm face of someone who had already finished doing the thing they came to do. Beside the head on the floor, there was something else. A small data drive. Black casing. Standard issue. The kind you could buy on any station. Raid looked at it. Then he looked at the security officers. That goes to every senator, he said. All of it. Even the ones who already knew. One of the officers stepped forward and put a restraint on his wrists. He did not resist. In the upper gallery. Juvith had not moved since the doors opened. He had been sitting in the observer section with his notepad on his knee and his pen in his hand, and he had watched all of it, and he had not written a single word. He was looking at Raid, standing in the speaking circle with restraints on his wrists and the calm face off someone who had already won. And Juvith was feeling something he did not have a clean name for. It was not fear. He had expected to feel fear. It was something closer to the feeling of watching something very heavy fall and realizing just before it hits the ground that the thing it was going to land on was the thing that deserved to be landed on. Senator Mira had not stood up. She had not shouted. She was sitting very still in her seat with both hands flat on her desk and the printed copy of Lena's partial document in front of her, the one she had been carrying since the morning Orvin had called it a fabrication. She was staring at Raid. Her staff would later try to describe her expression in their own written accounts of the session. None of them could find the right word. One of them wrote, "She looked like someone who had spent a long time waiting for a proof and had just watched it walk into the room on its own." Raid let the officers lead him toward the chamber door. He did not look at Orvin. He did not look at Mira. He looked at the drive on the floor of the speaking circle as he passed it. And then he looked up at the room. All 412 delegates, all 61 species, all of the most powerful political voices in the known galaxy, standing or sitting or frozen in their seats, staring at the floor of their most sacred space. That he thought about his sister walking out of this room 3 days ago with her head up. He had kept his head up too. He walked out the way a person walks, when they are tired but not finished. Steady, one foot in front of the other. The restraints on his wrists did not change his pace or his posture. Behind him, the chamber was still silent. In front of him was a corridor, and then a holding room, and then whatever came after that. He did not know what came after that, but he had given them the drive. He had said the words. He had stood in their circle and made them look at something they had been paid to ignore. The rest was not his to carry. He had done enough. 3 days after the rejection, the human delegation was still on the station. Transit clearance, officially. The paperwork had been delayed. These things happened. The Senate's administrative staff had not made it a priority, which was itself a kind-of message. But the humans had not complained. They had simply stayed, and in staying, they had become part of the station's background noise, something most delegates walked past without looking at. That suited Lena Solon perfectly. She had been eating in the lower-level cafeteria every morning for 3 days. It was not a place Senate members used. It served basic rations at low cost to maintenance workers, junior staff, and the kind of people no one important ever looked at twice. She fit in there without trying, which was another small thing about humans that most of the galaxy had not yet figured out. They were very good at being overlooked. Juvith found her on the second morning. He came in looking for a quiet place to sit and think, and found her at a corner table with a cup of something warm and her data tablet open in front of her. He almost left, then had decided not to. He sat down 2 seats away and ordered something from the machine on the wall. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither spoke for a few minutes. Then she asked him what his job was. He told her. J'ignorais. Observation and reporting. He said it plainly because there was no point pretending she did not already know she was being watched. She nodded like this was reasonable. Then she told him about Earth. Not the political parts, not the petition, not the rejection, not any of the things she might report. She told him about the weather. She said Earth had a weather system so complicated that even with modern computing, it could only be predicted accurately a few days in advance. She said the ocean covered 70% of the surface, and that humans had mapped more off space than they had of their own ocean floor. She said her favorite place was a city that sat on water, built on islands, connected by so many bridges that you could walk for hours and never run out of new ways to cross from one piece of land to another. Juvith did not write any of this down. He did not know why. He told himself it was not relevant. He almost believed it. While Lena talked to Juvith in the cafeteria, her brother was somewhere else entirely. Raid had spent the first day after the rejection doing what he always did in a new place. He walked it. Every corridor. Every junction. He found the maintenance routes, the service lifts, the sections where the lighting was slightly worse than it should be and nobody had bothered to fix it. He watched how the guards moved in, how long it took them to complete a rotation, and where they stopped to talk to each other, because guards always found places to stop and talk to each other. That on the second day, he started noticing faces. Not the delegates. Not the staff. Faces that did not fit a pattern. Two beings in particular, one with green color in common to the Dominion's outer provinces, one wearing civilian clothes that were slightly too well made for a civilian, who had been in 3 separate places where the human delegation had also been. Once was chance. Twice was possible point. 3 times was someone doing a job. He had seen this before. On the frontier, before a settlement got hit, there was always someone walking the ground first. Counting things, he did not approach them. He just made sure he knew exactly where they were. On the 3rd day, Lena found him. She pulled him into a service alcove and showed him what she had on her data tablet. It had taken her 2 days to compile because she was working from fragments, public records, meeting logs, financial flows that had been filed under categories designato, make them boring to anyone who was not looking for something specific. But she had been looking. She had found a connection between 3 Senate councilors and a financial network that traced back through 7 intermediary layers to the Dominion of Erech. And the payments, she explained, were not bribes for political support. They were older than that. They had started 11 years ago, the same year humanity had submitted its first Senate petition, the same year human scouts had been assigned to map the outer rim past Dominion territory. She said she thought the Dominion had been blocking humanity's membership not because they disliked humans, because they were afraid of where human scouts were going to look. There was something in that region off space, something the Dominion had buried. And if humanity got Senate membership, human exploration vessels would get full transit rights across Dominion-adjacent space. They could not allow that. Raid listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment. He asked her, had she transmitted any of this yet? She said no. She wanted to compile more before she sent it. Make it impossible to dismiss, he told her about the 2 faces he had been watching. She went still. Then she said she would be careful. He said, let me stay close today. She shook her head. She said if they moved together, it would look like they knew something was wrong, and she needed 1 more day to finish pulling the records. She would be in the delegation office all evening. It was a monitored space. Nothing would happen there. She was right about that. IT did not happen in the office. IT happened on the walkway between the office block and the transit corridor at the end of the evening, in a section where the lighting had been slightly worse than it should have been for some time. The official report, filed 6 hours later, said the railing had given way. It said a maintenance fault had been logged the previous week. It said the fall was accidental. The 2 faces Raid had been watching were gone from the station by morning. Raid sat in the corridor outside the medical bay with his back against the wall and his hands on his knees. A station medic came out after a while and said words at him. He heard them. He did not respond. Juvith found him there 2 hours later. He had come to say he was sorry. He had heard what the report said. He did not believe it either, though he had not told anyone that. He sat down against the wall beside Raid, because he had seemed wrong to stand over a person in that state. After a long silence, Raid asked him a question. He asked it quietly, without looking up, in the same tone a person might use to ask about the weather. Where does Emperor Varek sleep when he visits the station? Juvith did not answer, but he did not get up and leave. That he sat there, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one that had been there before.